Since March, our day-to-day lives have been directly affected by media reports on scientific findings. Our lives appear to be threatened by a virus that even scientists seem to know very little about. When it comes to the severity of the virus, for example, on the one hand, there's this well-known study from the Imperial College London that warned that the virus can cause millions of deaths globally and accordingly advised government and people to take immediate and strict measures. On the other hand, there are, for example, 2 studies from Stanford University that suggest that the US would end up with a mortality rate somewhere in the region of the seasonal flu. When it comes to the appropriate measures to be taken, there is this famous example of face masks. In April, the German Robert Koch Institute advised against wearing face masks, saying they would not necessarily help. A couple of weeks later, the World Health Organization stated masks are a key measure to mitigate transmission, and the Robert Koch Institute agreed. The consequences of these public disagreements, only to name a few of them, about such important topics have led to many people being confused and not knowing whom or what to believe. This pandemic reveals stark differences in the way different agents treat and communicate uncertainty. Scientists, on the one hand, perceive their work as a long process of constant reduction of uncertainty and generally do not consider study results irrevocable facts, but rather pieces of evidence. They face a new challenge. They have to communicate results more or less directly to the public and explain uncertainty to a broader audience. Journalists, on the other hand, are used to presenting information in the way that is easy to understand, interesting, and short. They are confronted with the fact that answers are suddenly no longer simple. They too must aim at communicating uncertainty properly. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's roundtable discussion entitled Consequences of the Broad and Immediate Public Interest in Epidemiological Findings Concerning COVID-19. 6 agents will talk about their experiences with the advantages and disadvantages of this sudden interest in research results. I'm very pleased to introduce you to our moderators for this roundtable. First, I truly look forward to our very own Rachel Heyard. Rachel will enrich our roundtable with expertise as a biostatistician, holding a PhD in biostatistics from the University of Zurich. She is a statistician in the data team of the Swiss National Science Foundation, and she's co-organizer of the Zurich R user group and member of the local organizing committee of the Youth R 2021. Second, it is an honor for me to introduce Birgit Voigt, who accepted our invitation to guide us through today's discussion. It distinguishes Birgit Voigt that she combines the topics journalism, health, and science in a unique way, holding master's degrees in economics from the University of Zurich and in political science from the Virginia Tech University. She has worked as a business reporter for Cash in the field insurance and healthcare, for the Tagesanzeiger as senior editor and team leader of the business and science section, and since 2002 she works as business editor for the NZZ am Sonntag. As a business journalist, Birgit Voigt has been covering the pharma and biotech sector for many years and as such has a broad experience in working with scientific papers. Birgit Voigt was awarded with the Knight Fellowship at Stanford University in 1992, and I'm very much looking forward to her and Rachel, of course, leading us through an interesting and hopefully productive roundtable. I'm giving the word to Birgit Voigt.
Thank you, Stella Bollemann. We are going to make a little change here, so while Rachel is taking her place, I welcome you all to this new event organized by the Swiss Statistical Society and her president, Stella Bollemann. We have a very strong lineup of speakers, and I look forward to a lively discussion. Now, as Stella has already introduced introduced the topic, the idea of this conference was born out of a huge general interest, and by consequence, the media in the knowledge and opinion of experts. However, communicating via media and with the media can be a very difficult and tricky business. The story of Bild and Professor Drosten this year in May is a reminder of how things can go wrong, Just to sum it up briefly, whoever hasn't followed this story, Professor Christian Drosten published a non-peer-reviewed paper and was criticized by Bild, misconstruing criticism by some of his colleagues. The way the tabloid scandalized the discussion was meant to discredit Drosten, but it also brought the open data approach into the limelight. Now we want to explore the tricky business of conveying complex information to a mass audience in times of a pandemic and in times where old ways of reviewing slowly by some gatekeepers has given way to a open data approach, who is much broader but also less structured, and therefore might actually seem sometimes chaotic. Since the topic could easily extend in different directions, we would also like to remind our speakers and our audience that the preferred focus of the discussion will be the challenges, will be on communication of science, and more precisely, challenges and possible solutions of communicating scientific results to the public. Now, I have the honor to introduce our very first speaker, Professor Matthias Egger. He is Professor of Epidemiology and Public Health at the University of Bern. He is Professor of Clinical Epidemiology at the University of Bristol, and he became a household name in Switzerland as President of the National COVID-19 Task Force until this summer. He is also President of the Research Council of the Swiss National Science Foundation. The title of his presentation is Spreading Panic, COVID-19, Epidemiology and the Media. Professor Egger, the camera is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me see whether I can forward this slide. Yes. So thanks very much for the invitation and for the very kind introduction. And welcome to another performance of my Panic Orchestra. I am going to talk a little bit about the Swiss National Science Task Force, how it was established. I'm going to talk about the timeline and how the media accompanied the establishment of this Panic Orchestra or COVID-19 Science Task Force. So the mandate of the Swiss National COVID-19 Science Task Force is on the website, and I'll show the address of the website in a minute. As I pointed out before, some people think this is a panic orchestra, other people think it's a science task force. A little bit of history. If we look at what happened in January, then certainly one of the important milestones was the publication of a paper by a group at the University in Bern, led by Christian Althaus, on the patterns of early human-to-human transmission of the coronavirus. And this was one of the first scientific studies to look at, how transmissible is this virus, and does it have the potential for a pandemic. They used data from Wuhan, and that was the data that was available at that time. And on the same day when this paper was published, the World Health Organization declared a public health emergency of international significance. And the scientific community in Switzerland, in January, but then also in February, got increasingly concerned about the official response to this situation. The Federal Office of Public Health repeatedly stated that this is not a big problem, this is not a threat to Switzerland. The BAG, or Federal Office of Public Health, also said that the mortality was in the same type of order like seasonal influenza. And a group of scientists facing this response by the health authorities in Switzerland then wrote a letter to the Federal Council, the health minister of Switzerland, and basically expressed their concern about the lack of realization that something might be coming our way, which we need to take very seriously, namely a pandemic. This sort of carried on through February. Of course, in March, on the 5th of March, we had the first casualty, if you like, the first death from COVID. And on the 18th of March, and I was at that meeting, we met with Federal Councillor Berse and people from the Federal Office of Public Health, and we discussed whether the authorities should be supported by a scientific task force. Interestingly, on the same day, the ETH established their own task force in order to support the authorities in Switzerland and to focus resources in the ETH domain. Now, the media at that time published the NZZ, to be specific, published an interview with Christian Althaus where he criticized the Federal Office of Public Health quite severely, and again stated that they do not take this situation seriously, and the media increasingly picked up on the problems at the FOPH, as you see in these media clips there. On the 23rd of March, we had the peak of the epidemic of the first wave with 1,455 cases. Of course, there were many, many more. These were just the cases that were diagnosed. And we developed the task force further. The ETH involved the Swiss National Science Foundation, Swiss universities, and the academies. This article in Watson is very interesting because it really gives this chronology in a very nice way. On the 26th of February, the BAG, the Federal Office of Public Health, still said that there will be just a few cases, as I show on this slide. Then on the 2nd of April, we really established the Swiss National Science Task Force. We got the mandate from the Federal Council, and this mandate went to the ETH Council, to the Swiss National Science, to Swiss universities, to the academies. I was put in charge of this task force. I very quickly had to establish it, and my deputy was Martin Ackermann, who is now leading the task force. It's also important to note that on the 19th of June, the extraordinary situation according to the epidemic law was abandoned, and the task force actually didn't have a mandate anymore all the way through July to the 1st of August, when a new mandate was established, which was very similar to the old one, but it was different in the sense that it was now led by Martin Ackermann, so I could step back, and the mandatees were the ETH Council and Martin Ackermann. So the mandate, just briefly summarized on this slide, and here you have the website of the National COVID-19 Science Task Force. Its mandate is really to give advice to the Federal Office of Public Health and to the Interior Department of the government, and also other authorities, and the cantons. It should identify research fields for Swiss science and identify possibilities for innovation for products and services. In practice, I think the task force mainly, gives advice to the Federal Office of Public Health and the authorities in general. The last 2 points haven't really taken off, I would say, so far, although this may change in the future. So the collaboration with authorities was mainly through requests from the Federal Office of Public Health. For example, could you look into this? Could you tell us what the evidence is on that, etc.? But also such systematic reviews, rapid reviews, or analyses of routine data were done because we felt they were important. So we also chose our own topics, and we made these works available on our website as so-called policy briefs typically. And I think so far we have, I think it's now 64 actually, such outputs published on our website. Now, these policy briefs were also picked up by the media quite a lot. Sometimes the media really summarized these policy briefs, and we were very grateful for that. There is one example here. This is the policy brief about influence of season, where we did a literature review on the impact of seasonality on transmission of corona, and many others were also picked up. For example, the one on comparing Sweden and Switzerland. In general, there really has been, and this was really something incredible, and for us scientists in this task force, really something very difficult to deal with. We were in the center of media attention. What you see on the left chart, and these are data from the Swiss media database, is the number of mentions in media items in this database of COVID in blue, and as a control of Trump in orange. And you see that the intensity of coverage basically mimics the first and the second wave. Of course, the last point for November is only half of November, so you can double this and you see that it would go up further, but it will probably come down like the second wave in Switzerland is now coming down. And you see that Trump, arguably the, event this year, and particularly in October and November, the elections in the US, had no chance competing with COVID in the Swiss media. And on the right side, you see an analysis of BAG, which is the Federal Office of Public Health, how often it was mentioned in blue. And again, you see that it mimics the two waves of the pandemic so far. And you see how the task force also is very present in the media. Obviously, in January and February, it didn't exist yet, so it couldn't be present. But in March, when it started to become established, it immediately jumped to 1,000 mentions per month. And in October, it almost hit 2,000 mentions. And in practice, this means that the members of the task force are constantly contacted by the media in order to get to these 1,000 to 2,000 mentions in the media. So every day I received perhaps 10 perhaps more than 10 requests for media, and the same happened to many others who were active in this task force. So a lot of the coverage was actually, I think, really helpful, and it gave us a platform to get across the messages that we wanted to get across. So, for example, end of June, I gave interviews basically in all Sunday papers after the Federal Council had decided to lift essentially all measures except the restriction on 1,000 people who could meet. And I said that this is a risk. And of course, I was alarmist again. I was a panic orchestra again. Other members of the task force were interviewed, and you see some of them on this slide. For example, also Samia Hurst or Nicola Lowe. What I also felt was very helpful is that other people, other experts who were not members of the task force, but who had quite a strong media presence as well, were and who often argued against the position of the task force. They, in several articles, were basically critically evaluated. And for example, this article in the science section, Wissen, from the NZZ, made it very clear that some of these positions were misguided and not scientifically founded. So the media, in many ways, supported the task force in its position, gave it a platform, and in that sense contributed to inform the population about what was going on, what the task force was thinking. On the other hand, the media also constantly looked for disagreements within the task force. So particularly the last weekend, you may have seen some of these headlines: chaos, there is a dispute, there is professorial nonsense, chaos again, false alarm, etc. So there was always this tendency of the media to look for disagreements within the task force, and it was very difficult for us as members of the task force to distinguish between speaking as, for example, in my case, a expert based at the University of Bern, or speaking as the head of the task force. Even when you said that, very clearly said that you are not now speaking for the task force, but this is your own opinion, in the end product, you would be presented as certainly a member of the task force, and implicitly you would be presented as someone who speaks for the task force. I should stress that today I also do not speak for the task force. I speak for my own, and this is just a little overview of my personal experience during this incredibly intense but also very fascinating time. Now, one issue that I really would want to go into a little bit more in detail is the second wave, which arrived in beginning of October. And you may have seen that some politicians did state that the task force did not warn them in time, and essentially that this was a big surprise. We couldn't know this might happen, such a second wave, etc. And this is something I personally feel very strongly about, and I would like to open a little bracket and introduce a little bit of science into this talk, and introduce you to the dashboard on the website of the COVID-19 task force, where you see the number of cases. I think maybe you see my mouse.
Professor Egger, we have to remind you that this is that we have still a long list of speakers.
This is about my third last slide. Don't worry.
Okay.
Yeah. So what you see here is the number of cases, first wave, second wave, and you see the basic reproduction number, which is a number that the media also talked about a lot. And as you all probably know, when it's above 1, it will create an exponential increase in the number of cases. And throughout the summer, as you see on this slide, it was actually above 1. And of course, there was an exponential increase in the number of cases during the summer. And one of the key policy briefs that we published already in April said that you shouldn't ease any measures when the effective reproduction number is above 1. But they did exactly that. In June, that's here, the politicians decided to ease the measures, and it stayed above 1. As you see, it increased exponentially. And we also said that when that is the case, you should tighten measures again to bring that reproduction number below 1. And when you compare Switzerland and Germany, you see that Germany did a much better job in yellow here to keep the numbers down during the summer, whereas Switzerland didn't. And you also see that the positivity rate during the summer in Germany stayed down, whereas in Switzerland it started to creep up and it reached levels that the WHO considers as an epidemic which is out of control already in September. So there was a lot of warning there, and there was a clear statement on how to deal with this. I'm going to skip that one, with this situation. So what are the lessons that I sort of think we should ponder on, this is my last slide, on this experience? I think the Science Task Force was overwhelmed by media interest. I don't think it dealt with this situation particularly well. I think it urgently professional media support, communication strategies, which is agreed by everyone. More generally, I think we need a continuing exchange between science, the health authorities, or the authorities in general, for example, also in the context of climate change, and politics. It's very difficult in a crisis to build new bridges. And we need mechanisms that, with a certain regularity or automatism, that lead to the establishment of a scientific task force if a next crisis should occur, but also that help to the early detection of crises in the future. So I think Switzerland really needs to think about how it dealt with this crisis and how this could be improved, and what the role of science is, and of course also what the exchange with the media, how that could be improved. So with that, I just wanted to thank really everyone in the Science Task Force, 68 people who work for free, often during their spare time, for this task force, and have done an amazing job in creating the scientific basis for how to deal with this crisis. Thank you.
And thank you, Professor Egger, for this excellent presentation. I think you really touched upon the huge problems of communicating conveying messages when you have a large group of people, but how to get this kind of impression of unity, or in terms of urgency, how to get this message across is a difficult task. And as you said in your last slide, maybe there is room for improvement in that area. We would like to come back to that during our discussions, but we will go right now straight ahead with the presentation of Marie-José Kolly. She is a journalist, so she will give us a little bit the other side maybe of this coin. She is a journalist with the online magazine Republik. She has specialized in data journalism and holds a PhD from the University of Zurich in phonetics and comparative linguistics. And she wonders in her presentation, why not print the small print larger? Mrs. Kolly, please.
You're still muted.
You have to put your mic on, please.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Sorry
you.
about that. Thanks so much for inviting me. It truly is an honor to speak after such a distinguished scientist. I hope you can see the presentation. I will tell you about a few of my thoughts on uncertainty and the communication thereof. These thoughts have evolved over time, and I think the story of this process is worth sharing. I hope you will find that too. As you said, I come from academics, and the typical process of my work as a researcher in linguistics was what many of you probably know from your daily work. It's experiment planning, arguing over methods and protocols, data collection, data exploration, inferential statistics, and then discussion, interpretation, paper write-up. And in this paper write-up, we kind of mirror the process from before. So we typically talk, first about the methods, and then we show the results. Maybe keep that in mind for later. And at some point after my PhD, I became a data journalist, and that was in many, many ways very refreshing. It was exciting, it was different. In many other ways, I worked with similar processes than before. However, my environment was extremely different. I worked at the Neue Zürcher Zeitung back then in a team of data journalists, designers, and developers. And around this team, the broader environment was also very different. There were teams of journalists covering different beats, for example, South American politics or macroeconomics or skiing. I had the privilege to work very closely with some data literate people who shared my habits and values, which are maybe thinking about methods, being precise, showing all the data, naming your sources, just a bunch of examples on the slides, being transparent on what methods you used, publishing your code and your data, using disclaimers when a graphic could be misleading. Polling data, such as here, should always say that polling has errors. Talking about uncertainty also in the articles, in the text, and visualizing uncertainty, super important. Here in hurricane data, but also in different ways in polling data over time or not over time, or here how to show maybe trend lines and make sure that people realize that it's just a trend line and the raw data is also around. But in this environment, there were also many other people. And when collaborating outside of our core data literate group, it was often hard to get these disclaimers, this methods talk, this uncertainty signaling into the journalistic product. I vividly remember the times where my colleagues and I had to fight for uncertainty signaling to be accepted in footnotes. For example, this very standard polls always come with uncertainty footnote that we wanted to be used for every graphic representing polling results. and it was not easy to get people to use it. Sometimes, if we were lucky, it was seen as a maybe necessary but very eye-roll stickler thing, and sometimes we really had to fight hard for a footnote. So typically, you'd have in data journalism often an article that shows some kind of results and interpretation based on data. And maybe sometimes you'd have a small methods section at the end of the article, or sometimes you'd have a methods article that was just about the methods and that was read, let's face it, only by a few nerds. Still important, but not really grand public. Then from January on, as you said, I had a new job as a journalist at Republik magazine. And shortly after, the pandemic arrived here too, and it democratized data science. So suddenly, science and data journalism, maybe niche things, became mainstream. Everybody's morning routine became looking at a data dashboard. And I observed in comment sections, in emails from readers, in discussions on social media, that many people argue with data and numbers that they have read somewhere. And in principle, this is fantastic. That's what we want. But we are still finding out about this pandemic. As many of you know, we did for a long time not have much reliable data at hand. And given the uncertainties that are in the data, it's even easier than usual to cherry pick or take numbers out of context. And we observed extremely partisan number talk in our comment sections. And this is one more very important reason to be very clear about what we can say with the data at hand and where we all have to be careful about a particular statement. Numbers and data visualization in particular are super powerful, and simplifying complexity or cutting corners will be all the more harmful, I'm afraid. So what can we do? As I already mentioned, communicate about uncertainties, of course, and make them more prominent, maybe, or maybe even impossible to ignore. In visualizations, for example, just an example, show ranges and not estimates, but also in text. And I think it became one of the USPs of the Republik COVID explainers and our COVID newsletter that we say what we don't know, or we say what we know, and sometimes to which degree we know it, but we also stress what we don't know or don't know yet. And it was also always important to us to talk about uncertainty, to directly address uncertainties. So that was one thing, quite easy to do. But when I actually started to play around with data for data-driven stories, I discovered not only was I uncomfortable with some of the data-driven things that I saw and read on the internet. I'm going to skip the example because of the time, but maybe we have time for this later. Not only was I uncomfortable with some of the work by others, I was also pretty uncomfortable with deciding how to handle it myself. And at some point in April, I had promised to create an article that compares the current situation in different countries and offers some hypotheses on why some countries fare better or worse. So I spent half a week, I think, pondering which was the best metric to show that. We all know there's no absolutely reliable metric for this. They all come incomplete with a bunch of downsides, with uncertainties, and they're certainly not directly comparable from country to country. And I felt very strongly that we needed to make our readers aware of these shortcomings, but still for what felt like very long days, I was very unsure how to tackle this. Footnotes, disclaimers, maybe a little paragraph, that seemed just not enough. And then I realized that this pondering actually was the story that I needed to tell. So this was not a disclaimer for a footnote, I felt. This was a disclaimer that needed to be an important part of the story, and it needed to be impossible to miss. So what I did back then for this story was a short introduction, then a note, hey, there's something crucial to talk about before even showing what we all want to know, the different countries. Then a little note with a loophole. that said, if you're really not interested in the methods talk, then please jump over it using this link. And then a step-by-step characterization of my thoughts and the path that led to the decision. And only then I showed the typology of different COVID waves in the different countries, thus kind of mirroring the order of appearance of scientific papers. First, we talk about the rationale and the methods, and then about the results. Maybe we have time for another example. When the idea for this other story, an interactive model of when the intensive care units would be overloaded, when this idea landed on my desk, sort of, my virtual desk, I was honestly also super uncomfortable about it. And after also a few days of turning it around in my head and thinking about maybe just killing it, we proposed to frame the story in a way that would make it very, very clear to readers that this was not us predicting things. This was just us building a simplified model to show which mechanisms play a key role for the question at hand, and that real models should be built by real epidemiologists, and that their predictions also are uncertain. And these disclaimers too needed to be built into the story structure. We felt they couldn't just be like little footnotes on below graphics. So yeah, to wrap up, I became more and more convinced that under certain circumstances, hiding disclaimers in footnotes is just not enough. Some disclaimers belong in the title, and some should not just enhance the story, they should actually be the story. And I'm convinced that it's really worth our time to find ways to print the small print.
Thank you, Mrs. Kolly. I think this was a highly interesting article that gave really insights into how journalists grapple with the problem of conveying complexity. Very honest. We have a problem with the connections. Who is not connected at the moment? Mrs. Kolly is not connected, so she can't hear the praise. But we are saying that you did very well.
Can you hear me?
Sorry. Yes, we can hear you again. Here you are again.
Yeah, I just had a last sentence to say, but I don't need to say it if you want to.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Just the last message that I wanted to bring across is that us journalists, and that's our job and not that of the scientists, or not only, is we need to write about these things and visualize these things in a way that makes people want to read them in an interesting and fun way, which is difficult, but also that's the job. That was important.
couldn't agree more, but not all of them go at the lengths to explain why we can't give precise answers to very complex questions. And this is let's say the story we grapple with is getting seemingly sometimes giving answers where there are no answers around, basically. So thank you for this talk, and we move on to another very well-known figure in the area of data and statistics in the times of the pandemic. Our next speaker is Professor Leonhard Held. He is professor of biostatistics at the University of Zurich. He is currently head of the biostatistics department at the Epidemiology, Biostatistics and Prevention Institute. What a name. He is director and master's, sorry, I lost it here. He's currently head of the Institute, program director of the master's program in biostatistics and director of the Center of Reproducible Science at the University of Zurich. He will talk about COVID-19 preprints, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Professor Held, please.
Thank you. Can you hear me, and do you see my screen?
We can hear you and we can see your screen.
Wonderful. So it's a pleasure to talk here. Thanks very much for the invitation. And I very much welcome the initiative by the Swiss Statistical Society to organize this meeting. As you said, I'm a statistician myself, so I'm proud of this society taking the lead here in this important task. I don't want to talk about statistics today. I want to talk about COVID-19 preprints. And so medRxiv is the most popular preprint server for preprints from the area of health sciences. And this is how the website currently looks like. And as you see, there is a small print here. Caution, preprints are preliminary reports of work that have not been certified by peer review. They should not be relied on to guide clinical practice or health-related behavior and should not be reported in news media as established information. Well, the lesson from the current pandemic is that unfortunately this advice is not really fulfilled in practice. So what's actually happening is that preprint servers are flooded with COVID-19 articles. I'll say a bit more about this on the next slide. And that preprints are often accompanied prematurely by press releases. So this is a small paper I wrote with a colleague here, Simon, in the statistics journal Significance, where we look at the number of preprints published during the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And here on the left, you see the number of preprints per day in the most popular preprint servers. And you see that these numbers go up to 60 per day. And on the right, you see the cumulative number of preprints. And just to note, the y-axis is on the log scale. So it's really an epidemic that we're facing here. And you see that some of the servers already reached 10,000 preprints during the course of this pandemic. So there is a flood of preprints. And obviously, not all of these preprints, can be of very high quality. Well, the good thing about these preprints is that they are very quickly available. And so this is aside from a recent paper from the link you see down here. Flourishing of preprints has been one of the few bright spots of the pandemic. So this is an example of a paper that was published as a preprint in June and had direct implications for the development of COVID-19 vaccines. And as you can see actually here, it was published 3.5 months later. And so if the world would have waited for peer review and that would have kept this information hidden for 3.5 months. So obviously the preprint model can be very useful to disseminate good science. And another example is the result from the recovery trial that was also published as a preprint initially, which has identified, one treatment for COVID-19 patients, dexamethasone, and that was then eventually published also a few months later. Now, there are also bad examples of preprints, and this is an example, I think, again, from medRxiv of a preprint that has been actually withdrawn. So you can not only withdraw papers, but you can also withdraw preprints. And there's a website, Retraction Watch, that monitors the retractions from COVID-19 papers. And I just checked those a few days ago. So from 38 retracted COVID-19 papers, 11 actually have been preprints. But there is a warning here. A preprint is usually withdrawn only at an author's request. So there needs to be an author who asks his paper or her paper to be withdrawn. So it's not the same as with journals where, papers can be withdrawn by the journal or by the editors. It's really the author. And perhaps this is one of the reasons why this number 11 is still fairly small. So, but this illustrates that, not every preprint is good. There are bad preprints. Preprints are also sometimes used to publish premature research findings not intended for submission to a journal. And perhaps the idea is that, feedback from the research community may or may not be incorporated and doesn't need to be addressed, acknowledged in revision. So it's kind of an easier deal with than if you would send your paper to a journal where you risk that the paper might get rejected, or that you have to respond to difficult research review questions. And publication on unofficial servers, so those are not official preprint servers, but servers which are not moderated and where there are no screening checks, that actually impedes transparency. And an example of this is this study by Jones et al. That was mentioned already in the introduction to this meeting, where the authors actually admitted that they wrote this article in less than 48 hours and published it on the institutional server. And then I was actually one of the first who wrote rather moderate criticism of the paper initiated by the task force, and then many others followed, including David Spiegelhalter and Kevin McConvey, that you see the paper here to the left, who even asked that, who pointed out, methodological flaws in the paper and requested the paper to be withdrawn from circulation. So as you know, this story, got worse and worse, and it went to an ugly dispute in the media, even, with Bild Zeitung and everything, and so it really shows that it's important that you publish papers of highest quality in preprints, just the same papers that you would also submit to journals, and that you also publish on official servers, which are moderated by external people. I should mention that the revision of that paper has actually been published on medRxiv, so on an official server then a few months later. So are there quality checks? Yes, there are. On Research Square, this is one of the preprint servers. They're actually badges. So you can demonstrate the quality of your preprint. A pre-screen badge is always obtained for every paper that is uploaded on this server. But you can also ask for methods reporting badge and data reporting badge, which provide some initial checks whether your preprint suffers basic standard requirements. And I've downloaded those reporting badges here from the website. So you see it's about statistics, it's about sample description. It's also about the design of the study. You will be asked if sample size calculations have been made, and so on and so forth. So a lot of things can actually be checked, in a pre-check and will ensure at least, some basic standard of such preprints. You can take this further to the limit and actually ask, well, shouldn't the authors perhaps submit a protocol for their study first, rather than the results together with the whole study? And this brings me to the idea of pre-registration and registered reports. So pre-registration, this is an idea which is well developed in clinical trials, means that you have to publish your protocol of your study on a website such that the public has access to it. And that was taken further over the last years as so-called registered reports. And this is a very interesting scheme that actually uses peer review of the protocol to check the design of the study. This is what's called stage 1 here. And then, if approved, the authors can conduct and analyze the study and write the report. And then there is a stage 2 peer review, which is usually shorter and faster. And then the results can be published. So you see in the bottom figure that there is a rapid rise of this registered report scheme. And you also see that it has been used during the pandemic. So the journals of the Royal Society actually had a call for registered reports on coronavirus, and in a recent blog, they discuss the success of this model, and the link is given here. So I think one of the lessons of this preprint epidemic is that peer review is vital, is as important as conducting and publishing studies. However, peer review is not really acknowledged, but it should be demystified. It should be addressed in the education of researchers, and it should be appropriately rewarded and acknowledged by journals and also by funders. And this is currently not the case. Your scientific career depends on your papers and how many papers you have and which journals you publish your papers. It doesn't depend on whether you peer review 10 or 100 or 1,000 papers. That's usually not taken into account. An important, more modern model is open review, that your peer review is actually de-anonymized, so that it's published together with the paper, and also the response of the authors is published together with the paper, because that improves transparency, and I think it should become the standard. An interesting idea for peer review of preprints is giving at this website www.prereview.org. That's a platform for the crowdsourcing of preprint reviews. So please check that out. That's, I think, a very interesting idea to have solid peer review of preprints.
Professor Heyard, if you could wrap it up, please, also, so we
yes,
can stay somewhat in line with the timeline.
Yeah, sure. This is my last slide. Thank you. So just to sum up, preprints offer a fast dissemination of research results of vital importance in the current pandemic. However, the lack of serious quality checks makes it difficult for non-specialists and the media to assess the scientific value of preprints. I think media coverage of preliminary research reports is dangerous evolution in science. And one way out of this dilemma is that the role of peer review needs to be acknowledged and supported to ensure high quality of research output. And I think new publishing models are around which help to improve the quality of science, and those include open reviews, pre-registration, and registered reports. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Heyard, for this insight into the problems of totally open, non-peer-reviewed papers and how to introduce quality hurdles in order to keep things somehow a little bit more on the, how shall I say that? Because everything can be misconstrued if you have too much of an open platform without any kind of quality check. So for the sake of staying safe and sound here on our transmission, we take a 5 minutes break in order to open up the windows. Everybody can get up, get a coffee, and we will meet again in in exactly 5 minutes, if possible, which would take us back into the transmission at 10:25. So please take a little break. Thank you. So welcome back. I hope everybody got a cup of coffee. We are proceeding now with the next speaker, Armando Massarenti. He's editor-in-chief of Domenica, the Sunday cultural supplement of the financial daily Il Sole 24 Ore. He is since 1986 editor of the Science and Philosophy section of the supplement, in charge of history and philosophy of science, moral and political philosophy, and applied ethics. He's also teaching a course, Science and Culture, at the School of Journalism at Bologna University. The presentation has the title Communications, Facts and Critical Thinking. The video has been pre-recorded, so stay with us. There you go.
To deal with the new coronavirus infodemic, as the World Health Organization requested, the main search engines and social media such as Google, Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, Reddit and Instagram have responsibly limited some of biggest problems their algorithms are generating. Web algorithms manage a huge amount of data and generally facilitate, often in order to manipulate, confirmation biases, echo chambers, the spread of fake news, the polarization of opinions, and the surges of hatred, anxiety, and insecurity. They influence not just consumers' choice, but also political decisions, as seen, for example, with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, Brexit, and electoral campaigns such as Trump's. Today, though, and for several months already, when we enter COVID-19 or coronavirus on Google or other search engines, we do not see the results that used to reflect the previous searches through which we are constantly profiled, but predetermined results from official and authoritative sources. Our research potential online is deliberately curtailed for greater and collective interests. Correct information guided by authoritative sources is considered a common good to be protected in a moment of emergency from the network's well-established mechanisms and their prevalent biases. Self-confirmation biases, first of all, which means that our search results always tend to coax us to reconfirm our beliefs and prejudices and to discard the data and facts that would refute them. Google and Cohn's initiative pushes us towards the most accredited information and away from misleading news with a nudge-type technique. This kind of soft paternalism, theorized by Richard Taylor, awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2017, pushed us toward virtuous behavior without our being aware of it. Certainly, it is worth initiative, but on closer inspection is still a manipulation, albeit to good ends. Fact-checking, the main antidote to fake news, is invaluable and should always be encouraged. Since the pandemic started, ANSA, Italy's main press agency, has adopted a blockchain fact-checking, the process used for bitcoins. To consult authoritative and accredited sources only, to respect exactly standards of scientific method, of peer review, etc., is certainly a good practice. Unfortunately, even the newspapers of record aren't enforcing it. For over 30 years, I have been a cultural journalist and editor in an important cultural supplement. Thanks to my background as a philosopher of science and to reputed and scholarly collaborators, I have always thought it was necessary to nip in the bud fake news, fake debates, and both-siderism on many issues, from creationism to miracle cures against cancer, from stem cells quackery to climate change denial. The main mistake media of record should avoid is to blur the difference between science and pseudoscience. Putting a charlatan on an equal footing with a real scientist in a public debate does enormous damage to public opinion. It also distorts the most genuine and controversial aspects of the scientific enterprise, which is inherently anti-dogmatic, self-critical, and based on a rare form of intellectual honesty. But above all, it ensures that quackery and quarks are recurrent. Fake science leverages deep-rooted biases and is remembered even when real scientists have debunked it again and again. For this reason and others, fact-checking and especially nudge strategies may not be enough. But do not highlight, indeed in the case of Marie-José, someone weakened, a vaccine against disinformation and confusion, but is critical thinking. That's why Professor Antonietta and Mira and I wrote The Data Pandemic. The subtle, here is the vaccine, signals the need to inject critical thinking into the reader to provide a series of mental tools that partly coincide with the scientific method, probabilistic thinking, and data science. The basic idea I would like to convey in these few minutes is that in communicated knowledge, telling the truth might not be enough. We also need a strategy to dismantle the hindrances of two understandings. These are legacies of our hunter-gatherer past and deeply rooted in human nature. Biases that were effective shortcuts in the Paleolithic are harmful and misleading in modern society. Some biases, cognitive illusions and fallacies, can be corrected, others cannot. At most, we can be aware of them. When our visual system shows us one segment is longer than the other, although they are the same, as in a famous example of psychology of perception, we will perceive them incorrectly even when we have measured them objectively and are well aware of the error. Probabilistic thinking provides many ways to correcting erroneous or misleading intuitions permanently. A simple example is the so-called birthday paradox. I may intuitively think that the probability of at least two people in a group sharing a birthday is such lower than it is. But I can easily show that among 23 people, I may intuitively think that the probability of at least two people in a group sharing a birthday is such lower than it is, but I can easily show that among 23 people, the probability is about 51%, among 30 people it is greater than 70%, and among 50 people it reaches near certainty, 97%. Once we understand the reasoning and acquire the data, our mind will reject the wrong intuition and we will think more carefully. Probabilistic reasoning can correct our wrong intuitions about the effectiveness of fake masks, a hotly disputed topic, in just a few steps. Why masks work better than you think, a video on YouTube, shows why we are all safer the more people wear masks and that the protection is higher than we think. A few rational moves can change the skeptic's mind. Likewise, it is possible to explain to a national audience how RT works and what the consequences are if its value is too high, as Angela Merkel did. The example could go on. Some biases are much harder to dispel, of course. We know our brain doesn't handle exponential curves well. Still, we have innate mechanisms for computing and simple Bayesian reasoning. The finitist subjectivist version of probability and Bayes' theorem are useful tools. With Definetti, we define probability as very close to common sense, as our degree of belief in the occurrence or otherwise of a given event. With Bayes' theorem, we are able to change our beliefs on the basis of a new evidence. It recently happened to some hypotheses about herd immunity. And there is more in our toolbox, courtesy of Nobel laureates in economics. Psychologist Daniel Kahneman, his students Richard Taylor, and before them Marie-José have empirically shown that Homo economicus rationality does not dictate our choices, and that we make a series of systematic errors. Nash, Selten, Sani, Aumann and Schelling, and now Milgram and Wilson game theory helps us to understand how social cooperation works or doesn't, why it can be rational to wear a mask, for instance, and equally rational to be a free rider and enjoy the benefits of social cooperation without wearing one. In fact, even those who do not wear a mask benefit if a sufficient number of other people do. Likewise, those who do not get vaccinated also benefit from herd immunity. We should trust the citizens' ability to develop critical thinking. Cognitive sciences and neurosciences have transformed it into a scientifically coherent and effective discipline. We increasingly understand how the mental processes lead to the formation of opinions, beliefs, and decisions, and particularly how they depend on emotional and framing factors, that is, on how decision-making context is represented. Critical thinking allows people and citizens to make their own conscious political, economical, and financial decisions. It also requires the development of mental skills to perceive and to react to the manipulation induced by the commercial use of data. Richard Thaler, again, has proposed a different way to reduce decision-making biases, at least in the field of public good, such as organ donation policies. Choices should be represented by constructing the decision-making context, he suggests, in order to limit frequent errors. The gentle push or nudge, therefore, results from a context description that influences the citizen's choice for his own benefit. The discussion on nudging has shown its advantages and limits which should be investigated. It does not require citizens to be educated in critical thinking, a task that can be difficult with large masses of individuals. But bypassing critical thinking leads to a soft or less than soft paternalism. In a communicating context strongly pervaded by proliferating fake news, it seems to me a significant limit. Focusing on critical thinking without excluding other strategies can appear more challenging. Yet, I believe, is the most far-sighted option, and for our educational system, maybe the most urgent.
Thank you, Armando Massarenti. I think this was an excellent. You tackled a very difficult topic, the fact of how easy the mind plays tricks on our perception, and how easily the bias can be exploited. Very difficult task to steer against this. Now, without any further delay, we have our next speaker, Clelia di Serio, from University of Milano. Professor Serio is Professor of Statistics at the Faculty of Psychology of the University Vita, Salute, San Raffaele in Milano. Formerly a lecturer in the Faculty of Medicine at the same university, she is directing the University Center for Statistics for Biomedical Science since 2005. Professor Di Serio talks or asks the question, COVID-19 data, how far are lots of data providing knowledge? Professor.
Yes, just a sec. I will share the screen. Okay. Can you see?
Yes. Yep.
Okay. So, thank you for inviting me. I'm Clelia Di Serio. I'm a professor in medical statistics in Milan, as announced, and also a professor at the biomedical faculty of the Swiss University in Lugano. And I'm here. I just wanted to connect myself very much with a previous intervention, especially the intervention of Leonard Health, because here I'm also trying to talk about how do we really get and gain in knowledge from these huge amounts of data that is overwhelming every day, all of ours. So what are we expecting from COVID data? Actually, as a statistician, I will talk about a statistician, and I will also talk as readers, as a normal person that reads news every day. So what do we do with inference? So inferential processes for statisticians is just an inductive process where one can gain generalizability of conclusion from a sample. And I think everything matters with this. So how can we really estimate and how can we really detect the epidemiologic parameters that we need from the data that we have, from the clinical data? So we are sort of going through what I call data storm, because so I just wanted to just figure, I feel like this. So I feel like there is this storm, there is this tsunami that was COVID, but that were also COVID data. And then the next question is how much we really gain, because we all know that lots of data or big data doesn't mean big information, and they could mean lots of noise. So I come from Lombardy, and as everyone knows, Lombardy was the first and one of the most severe hit region in the world. So nowadays we can unfortunately count about 20,000 deaths just in one region of Italy. And actually, so we were just going through all this kind of information since the beginning. I wanted just to report an Italian data, because we have lots of problem in Italy with data sharing, with trying to get really access to this data. So this is the data of the ISS, which is the Institute of Health of Italy. And then we have this kind of data. So these were just the case in the beginning, and these are the deaths from the beginning up to April, so in the first phase. And then we have other data like this. So this is just the rate of death in April, and now unfortunately is still growing, and we still are having more than 500 deaths per day. But and then here it's a very interesting also data, which is the excess of mortality. There is just a few persons that talk about excess of mortality, which is a very important parameter, because here, for instance, in Lombardy was 100% of excess of mortality. But I think this is also an underestimate, because in that period there was lockdown, and therefore no one was moving. So all the other causes for death were removed. And so I think this is really an underestimation. And but the main point I wanted just to take a message from this presentation is that how really we can say what was said from the communication, from the data that we have. How was really translated correctly the data in knowledge. So corresponding to this data storm, there has been also a publication storm, and as Leonard really pointed out very well, so there was the problem of the preprint, but there was the problem of the publication. So we had, by the end of August, 33,643 publications on COVID. So there was no, there was an extraordinary, unprecedented need of findings in this period, but there was never a situation where all over the world everyone was publishing on COVID. So for all the researchers, statisticians, clinical, so it was something frustrating. If you don't have a paper on COVID, you will not publish anything in that period. And the time to publication for submission in April, March, if you had something on COVID, was 20 days. If you had something without COVID, was never. And there was never a situation such this where publication had a direct and immediate impact on science and politics directly, straight. And we reach this amount of data, 54 millions of cases, more than 1 million of deaths, and then all the main journals, and I'm talking about Lancet, New England, that they have more than 50 as impact factors, so they really impact sciences. They sort of came out incessantly with publications, and with 20 days from the submission to the publication. Then we had something like this. At some point, some scientists, and I'm one of these, with other statisticians, we tried to build a core. They were just a bit suspicious because there were these two papers, the Lancet and the New England paper on COVID, that they were claiming they had data on 96,000 patients in 700 hospitals in April. And everyone who works on COVID data knew that was impossible to have all this data in April. And I just checked into the Italian data, and I knew perfectly that this data for 8 hospitals with 4,000 cases in 14th of March were not there, or if they were there, they were not published and they were not available anywhere. So this was very suspicious. So we started asking for a concern, and this is the end of the story. So they just retracted. I think that never before in the science history, New England and Lancet retracted the same day in the beginning of May this paper. This retract, they were just saying we weren't able to get information on data sources. And what I was really astonished is that they just finished with this. And I think that the responsibility of the editors is very, very important here, because except for the ethics of researchers, okay, they were from Harvard and so on, but this doesn't mean that they are necessarily true. They should be checked as anyone else, and this was very easy to check, as I checked, as my colleagues checked, and they should have checked this. And okay, if it were just a publication, doesn't matter, but so we had retracted, and the consequences of this retraction were really directly on sciences. So when communicating, one should first check data sources, and this is the first responsibility of a journal. And immediately after these two publications, before retraction, researchers all over the world, and the OMS is Italian, WHO trial on anti-malaria stopped because the papers were claiming there was earth problems. So this is just an example, but it's a really shocking example to me of how much we are just we should always sort of check also what happens in the main journals. So, and then I asked, after more than 33,000 publications, are the most important questions, epidemiologic question on COVID answered, which is the prevalence of the disease? Very basic question, first class in epidemiology. Which is the fatality rate of the disease? Which is the prevalence of immunization? How reliable are COVID tests and serological tests? How is the viral load related to infectiveness and to immunity? So these are the main question on an infectious disease. So did we find an answer in this data storm? Did we find answers in this publication storm? So this is my question. And unfortunately, I really didn't find the answer, because I talk about really what I know very, very well, which are also the Italian data. So the real problem, from not just from a statistical point of view, but from a communication point of view, is the problem of representativeness. So if the representativeness is the main thing to manage to generalize conclusions. So, and the representativeness get along with reproducibility of findings. And how reproducible are these findings? And this is extremely important for prevention, because prevention means that we have to, thanks to this data, to identify before a low risk group, then a risk group, high risk group, and then early clinical symptoms, and then the active disease. And we have to intervene here as soon as possible from this data. So the epidemiological question were, which is the prevalence of the disease, lethality, prevalence immunization, as I said, sensitivity and specificity of the test, relation from the viral load and infectiveness. How much did we gain of information? These are just some data that just come every day. And for instance, on which data are we reasoning, at least in Italy? This is the positive rate. But what is the positive rate? It's very simple. It's a rate. So in numerator, there is the number of positive tests. In the denominator, there is a number of what? There is a number of tested persons or of tests. Also, this is not clear. And all over the world, they just say positive rates, but it's very different. For instance, if in the denominator just have the number of tests, you have the controls, and every country just perform a different policy in controls. For instance, in Italy, you need always 3 controls, 3 negative controls before you can get out of the quarantine. In other countries, you don't need a control and you just get on symptoms, for instance. So what is this rate? Is this a rate? To me, it's not a rate. Also because the numerator is not a part of the denominator, because the denominator is the positive tests that are communicated that day, and the denominator is the tests that are made that day. But the positive tests are not the result of the denominator, so it's not a rate as far as I know. And look at this. So many countries are thinking of the case fatality rate. Case fatality rate usually intuitively in people just resemble something like lethality, how dangerous is the disease. But is this something true? First of all, in Italy, for instance, the population that we represent changes every week. Now we get in August, we were testing. First of all, there were never a real screening. So they told about 20% of screening, but not even that, because they were testing people coming back from vacation. So they were typically young. They were going in the island to get fun, of course, young people. And then maybe they were more exposed. So we're not a random sample. And now what happens? So in this period, which is August, there was about 14 case fatality rate. So it's very high. How come? We said that was stopped. The COVID was not there any longer. So everyone was going out without really caring. And then look at that. Now that is so bad, so poorly, now we are at about 4 case fatality rate. What's that? Of course, it's a matter of denominator. I know it's simple, it's trivial, but it's a matter of denominator. So now, for instance, in Italy, we gave up. So the probability of being positive is not constant. This is why also RT estimation, they are based on the idea that the probability of being positive is constant in the population, but it's very different. And now, for instance, what the reported probability refers to people they gave up to contact tracing and refers to people that have only symptoms. So of course, if you are testing people that have symptoms, you have very high probability of finding a positive. So the total positivity rate will just jump and with no control. But this doesn't mean that there are more cases and more infected. And you can't compare this with what we were doing in August and so on. This is just to say, so after complaining, because we also have to send some positive message, we say, how can we help with statistics? So here I'm invited to the Swiss Statistical Society. And so we have a very big responsibility, because never like in this period, statistician, medical statistician, epidemiologists became opinion leaders. Before we were just considered very often as technicians, right? And they were in the backstage. Now epidemiologists are invited to talk and the TV. So they really play an important role also in trying to give, to spread light a bit in this darkness of this amount of data that is sort of overwhelming and where everyone is thinking. So First of all, we have to clarify that all this data and all these studies are not observational studies. They are case series studies. There is no design. And therefore, they should be analyzed very carefully because confounding and bias is all over. And interpreting anything in terms of causality requires lots of statistical a lot of statistics, of course. So statistics can be very helpful in correcting this unbalanced design, in providing tools which are complicated, are not that trivial. So it's not that easy. I see papers that are published with tables, univariate statistics, and maybe bivariate statistics for very important clinical trials.
Professor Di Serio,
yes.
Please also watch the time, and if you
yes.
can come to an
How
end.
much do I have?
I'd say 1 more minute.
Yeah, okay, I'm right at the end. Okay. So we can do very much on that. So we can do predictive models, we can do explicative models. So right now we can help a lot, for instance, in integrating data. This is a very good paper in Nature that was in October, right now, on integrating the Serio model with the mobility network models. And this is as predictive models or also explicative models, like improving therapeutic protocols and going through in the direction of precision medicine with a sort of, for instance, using Bayesian network or trying to find to profile patients in a very precise way. So that was my talk. And I think that the very important things that everyone is telling this morning is that data sharing is the way out. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Di Serio. Thank you for moving with us or helping us to navigate the data storm to some extent and showing a little bit a way out. We come to our last speaker for this morning.
Sorry, I tried to okay.
Yes, thank you. We come to our last speaker, which is Matthias Matzenauer. He is the Vice Director of the Office of Statistics of the Canton of Zurich and a board member of the Conference of Regional Statistics Offices. He is a data man with the talent to make the data visible and therefore meaningful. His presentation has the title, Communication in Official Statistics, Dissemination versus Public Participation. Mr. Matzenauer, please. He's still muted. You are still mute.
Thank you very much. Do you see my presentation?
Yes, we see it.
So, thank you, the Swiss Statistical Society, for the invitation, and Birgit Voigt for the introduction, and to my co-presenters for the insights. As Armando Massarenti showed us, intuition can trick us, so we need statistics. Talking about uncertainty is hard to communicate. We have to fight for it, as Marie-José Kolly vividly showed. And the driven presentation of you, Clelia, Di Serio, that's the spirit we need. And we need to ask the right questions. We have an opportunity here for strengthening our cause. I will talk about how we used this opportunity in the Statistical Office of the Canton of Zurich. My focus will be on possible solutions for communicating official statistics to the public. You will see that there are similarities between public statistics and communicating science. I don't talk about the role of media. Marie-José already talked about it with far more expertise. And just a second. So, you all showed science and statistics can save lives, but this is what we get. Uncertainty is hard to communicate and even harder to endure. So we tend to interpret the most probable outcome as certain. And then there is the ignorance of facts, whether deliberate or negligent. On the left is Senator Inhofe in the US Senate illustrating that climate change doesn't exist. How can we reach the people in this environment? Certainly not with the visualization on the right alone. What this picture shows too is that the sovereignty of interpretation, die Deutungshoheit, is dead. Thank you for your attention. No, there are some solutions to this.
You'd help us to make some time here. That's good.
There are some solutions, and I will talk about the solutions here as well. The most cited source for COVID-19 numbers, infections, hospitalizations, deaths, and so on in Switzerland was created by the public. We at the Statistical Office of the Canton of Zurich were just enablers. By the way, since I have two Italian co-presenters, our reference for this dataset was the dataset of the Italian Civil Protection Department. The process is error-prone. When a canton changes their file or their web page, we have to adjust our scrapers. It's a lot of work. So why is it not only the most cited, but the trustworthiest resource as well? When the Federal Health Department makes a mistake, there was always a public outcry. When there was a mistake in our data source, people wrote us kindly to ask if this might be a mistake shortly after it was corrected. Why this difference? To understand this, we have to look at how official statistics communicate. Dissemination is still the most referred to communication term in official statistics. Dissemination means broadcasting without feedback from the audience. The citizens, in the best case, believe what is proclaimed. This gets a bit better when there is a feedback possibility. When we listen to questions, we understand what is not understood. But better understanding of science or statistics alone doesn't lead to epistemic and moral trust. This is more complex. And it does not lead to action. If we want action too, we have to empower the people, empower them in the use of data. They even need to make their own conclusions, may be guided. And if we want to empower them, we have to let them participate. Dissemination is based on the fact that public statistics is a brand, a highly trusted institution. We protect this with an ethics charter, with principles, and with peer reviews. It builds upon reputation. In public statistics, we follow the principles, the communicating vessels from my last talk at the Roundtable of the SSS. They are the compass, Clelia, Serio, to navigate the data storm. They make the disseminated facts trustworthy. We can visualize the data to be more appealing. We can make data accessible and machine readable for reuse, even share code to make the analysis reproducible. We can get pretty far with good dissemination, but the public still treats us as transcendent. How to improve that? With two-way communication. Only if we know the questions of the audience, we can try to give an answer. One of the best examples in the Canton of Zurich that I saw was the live talk from Christiane Meyer, Cantonal Medical Officer, at a podium from Tagesanzeiger. Say what you don't know, admit mistakes, answer all questions patiently, and admit uncertainty too. But to truly get rid of the only claimed sovereignty of interpretation, we have to go even further. We need to involve the people directly. We have to communicate with the public at eye level. We need public participation in all steps of the value chain of public statistics, from data collection to data cleaning, data analysis, data communication, and publication. People need to have ownership of the data they produce. Like this, we get engagement and civic data activism. It means empowerment of the citizens. Statistics is a hard methodological discipline, and we can take no shortcuts in communication either. Public participation can go as far as deliberative opinion polls, a concept of a colleague of yours, Birgit Voigt, from Stanford University. James S. Fishkin first described the concept of deliberative polling in 1988. Deliberation emphasizes the use of logic and reason as opposed to power struggle. The act of thinking about or discussing something and deciding carefully. So why not make deliberative interpretation polls? Like this, we have to explain our findings in a way that everyone understands. It's not about being opinion leaders, Clelia, Serio, but opinion coaches, I think. Impossible? No, we did it. And if we have time, I show you how. The COVID-19 case numbers is not a data set from our office. We are just enablers and connectors and coaches. Here are the top 6 contributors of this data source. Only 2 of them work at the Statistical Office of the Canton of Zurich. There are over 55 contributors to this data set. Some work for other statistical offices. We had great support from the ETH task force. Some are data activists and some journalists. There is no secret sauce black magic code in this repository. Thanks, Timo Grosenbacher, for this great word. Everything is publicly available. Users can even see who corrected which data, when and how, as you see on the right. We had up to 800 commits to this repository per week. On our main communication tool, Slack, up to over 1,000 messages were exchanged per day. More than half of the members of this channel are external collaborators. Another recent example is the project led by our Christian Ruiz, CO2 versus CO19. Good ventilation is a recommended measure against infection. If the CO2 level is too low, we need to ventilate. How do we get the people to action? If we help them get their own data, build their own CO2 sensors. They learn how data is collected, understand what problems arise with the measurements and the data collections. They come to their own conclusions. This leads to engagement. It is a project to foster data literacy and statistical literacy in the public, mainly at schools. We have to engage with our audience and start a dialogue instead of proclaiming a sovereignty of interpretation. We shouldn't be gatekeeper to knowledge, but enabler of deliberation. It's not a matter of resources, but of priority. Thank you very much for your attention.
Excellent. You get a point for being very quick. Thank you. We will take another very short break, 5 minutes. We finish here our first round of the speakers, and we'll move on to the discussion. I hope you all have maybe 1 or 2 questions sent in. And to the speakers, I would remind you, I'll say it now before we get into the next round, but if you want to join the discussion, since we have only a visual, please raise your hand, give us a little sign, and then we will give you opportunity to ask your questions so we can have a lively discussion. But first, another short break, 5 minutes maybe, and then let's get restarted in at 10:16, 10:17. Is that okay? 11:15. Sorry, 11:15. I misread my watch here. 11:15. Thank you. So welcome back to our last part and we move into the discussion round. Just 1 or 2 housekeeping rules, one more time. So in order to have a good discussion, if you want to say something, please raise your hand physically so we can see it on the screen. And we can also receive messages online via email. And I think we want to explore now 3 topics, more or less. We want to focus on what you said. First one would be the question of making the research understanding in times of mass attention, and it goes. We might actually start with what Professor Egger said, and how the media attention, how it somehow discussing and conveying messages, how this spiraled out of control with this enormous media attention. The next part would be a little bit the discussion between preprints and this enormous mass of data that was created versus how do we make a quality assurance. And finally, maybe that wasn't really touched upon it, and we'll see how this works, but the question of some of the scientists also took a very active position in trying to convey their research, their opinions, and where is the objectivity within what they said towards the activism and the idealism that they showed there. So I want to start with a question for Professor Egger, and I admit that this also comes as a journalist. I was a bit amazed, to say the least, that the task force didn't expect that the media attention would be so intense, and that you did not somehow foresee that and didn't put some kind of a communication plan into place. Was this just because there was no time for it, or were you truly surprised by the enormous media attention you received, that the entire task force received, and the way it developed, that everyone started talking about what they knew?
Thank you for that question. Yes, I do think that many of us were surprised at the intense media interest that we got, and many of the members of the task force are not that media savvy. They're really scientists. They perhaps had media training once or twice, but they are not, professionals in their interaction with the media. Please realize that the Science Task Force is a voluntary body which doesn't receive any funding. So it was also a question of resources. This has now changed. The task force now is supported by the media professionals from ETH, which is a very good thing. But as you saw last weekend, the problem isn't really solved, and I think we still need to work on that.
I want to hand over the question to Marie-José Kolly as a journalist as well. What do you think happened there, and maybe you should or could explain to us why the media is focusing or perceiving what comes out of the task force in terms of different questions as chaotic, and why are they framing it that way?
I think this is just my humble opinion as someone who has had experience as a journalist for about 4 years, and I was a scientist before, so more experienced people may say something different, but my point here would be that why do the media maybe stylize this as chaotic? There are probably 2 reasons, I would say. One is not so pretty, we all know that some stories gain more attention than others, and what I read the past weekend looked to me like something small that has been made bigger because it sells better. I have talked to many of those task force members, sometimes at the same time as other journalists, and then sometimes I can compare how we at the Republik magazine framed what they said and how others framed it, and it seems pretty clear to me that there are differences. And the other thing that maybe allows journalists or allows people to perceive that there is chaos is that I think we all need to do a better job in communicating what science is, that there is not at a certain point in time one truth, but that there are data and models, and that those scientists all work with the same facts, and that there are hard facts, and that then there is a point where there is also interpretation, and where maybe one scientist interprets the data at hand a little bit differently than another scientist because of their experience, because of their past knowledge, because of whatever. And that's fine. And that they just need more time and more experience to find out more and to then come to a consensus. But like, I think there's a difference between consensus and tiny little, not disagreements, but little different positions, and the crazy positions that we can see that some scientists hold, or maybe crazy is not the best word, but like we have a range, probably within the task force, you'd have a range of different positions, and then there's a consensus, and this range is much smaller than what you'd hear from certain people that are active on YouTube. That's how I would see it.
Professor Egger, I saw you raised your hand, but I would like to ask also Signora Massarenti, in your experience, what is the difference between what the media want and what science is trying to say? Can you unmute your mic?
Okay, sorry. My experience is based on the Italian journalism. I am a journalist, a cultural journalist for a supplement, a cultural supplement, and as I said, I have a background in philosophy of science. So I observed in many years, because I started this job in the 80s, in the last century, I noticed that it's difficult to transmit the scientific method to the general public because the common sense is really something very different, as you know, as is obvious, of course. And sometimes, in many cases in Italy, we had, before the COVID-19, many cases in which pseudoscience and sciences were compared in a very, very bad way, in a very confusing way. Now, I think COVID-19 it was useful to clarify in some way the role of scientists in society, in Italy especially, because it was very, very confused before that. I tried in my work always to make clear the scientific positions. So, and also so the scientific position where, for example, there was some controversy like creationism, pseudo-controversy, not a real controversy, a real scientific controversy, but something that was very confusing and very and not scientific, like miracle cure of cancer we had in Italy, or stem cells research that cures everything, or something like that. So I try to, in my work, in my cultural journalist work, to inject to the people the real way scientists think, scientists check the facts, check the data, and COVID-19 with Antonietta Mira, we thought was a good occasion to think about some problems of communications that's related with the biases that common sense cultivated everything, because the real human nature is really apt to cultivate these biases. And social networks are very, very, very important in considering this consideration, because social network in this idea that all people can participate, can tell their opinions, they're not well based, scientific based opinion, and they are very convinced to be right in many issues that more than the real scientists. So this implied a lot of problems. We try to put together in a book the pandemic data. But as I try to say, the message is very simple. We have to make attention to educated people to avoid systematic errors. And there is a very, very good and long discussion in many fields in the scientific studies. I mentioned game theorists. I mentioned the psychologists. I could mention also anthropologists, because they designed the human nature in a kind of way what is very useful. If we don't understand that people are really apt to make some kind of mistakes, we don't make a very good communication. We don't. So this is my idea. So to colleague journalists, I noticed that they are very aware of it in their speeches. And generally speaking, I hope that journalists could be helpful. But I would like also suggest to the Statistical, to your institution, to promote the statistics literacy, thinking about this kind of literature, of scientific literature, of systematic error, economics, because especially in COVID-19, and then I end my request, my answer. It's clear that knowledge and decisions, and good decisions of people are strictly related. No, if we communicate a very good data, people can make good decisions. And another time, with the good decisions are related to good rationality, good ability to avoid a lot of errors that economics shows in many situations.
Thank you, Mr. Massarenti. I'm not quite sure it's either Mr. Matzenauer or Professor Heyard. I would challenge you, also Herr Matzenauer, I would challenge you when you say, each one of you basically said, we have to educate and engage the public. What if the public does not really want to be educated, but they want rather, it's a very complex problem. It seems that science itself doesn't really have clear answers to the problem. How can you really expect a broad public without much education in statistics or the complexities of reading epidemiological data? Can you expect them and also the journalists to understand what is happening when you yourself doesn't really have a grip on the data, the masses of data, when you quarrel among each other with the previewed studies or previewed papers have the quality to have enough of high enough quality data. So, Mr. Matzenauer, a little more precise, how can we engage and educate the public? How do you want to go about this?
Yeah, how do we reach beyond these responsible journalists like Mr. Massarenti and Ms. Kolly? That's the questions. And Mr. Ecker said voluntarily. It's voluntarily, yes, but it's a key factor in talking with the public and engaging with the public. It's a key factor of responsibility and for science, if we want science to be actionable. And leading a cultivated debate is really important, and always foster this cultivated discussion we all have to, all scientists, all public statisticians, everybody has to engage in this discussion, in this dialogue. And it's also about statistical and data literacy, as Mr. Massarenti said. And we have to find ways to engage this public. And as I said, it has to be on eye level. So we have to go to the people and not wait for them to come to us. I think that's the main part. And now I give over to Leonard Held for his answer.
Yes, thank you. I think I want to answer your provocative question with a provocative answer. I think it's not the public that we need to educate, it's the scientists we need to educate.
I couldn't agree with you more.
and one problem, I mean, there's a problem in the incentives of science currently, that quantity counts more than quality. And but another problem, I think, is that many researchers know little about methodology, statistical, epidemiological methodology. Many studies are conducted with no or little involvement of adequately trained methodologists, statisticians for the research at hand. So basically, methodological illiteracy is still accepted. And I think that's a major problem. And Clelia mentioned the two papers that got retracted from Lancet and New England. And, you know, one interesting aspect of those papers is that there are only, I think, 4 authors on the paper, on the author list. And there's not even one, you know, trained methodological statistician that you would expect, you know, if you publish a paper that analyzes registry data from all over the world, you know, I would actually expect maybe 4 or 5 of them. And not
just for authors also.
Yeah, so I mean that would be my first suspicion. You know, there must be something wrong with this paper if there is no trained statistician here on the author list. So I think that there's really need to for a change also in the way how scientists think about methodology. That there is need that they realize it's really important to get methodology right, because this is the backbone of science. And once this is done, then we can discuss, about proper communication to the public, and that would be for me kind of, another very important step. But I think first science has to do kind of, clean its own household before it discusses whether to educate the public.
Thank you, Rachel. You wanted to add to that?
Yes. Thanks a lot, Leonard, to talk about this issue. I'm pretty sure we're coming back to education of scientists. But also Matthias Egger talked about building bridges between scientists and politicians and the media. So I would also ask Professor Di Serio, if you have an idea, because you're also involved in communication of these numbers, or these Italian numbers, very early on in the crisis. So what would be an idea that you would have to kind of build these bridges early on before we are in the middle of the crisis? And how can we kind of keep these bridges kind of in place, even if the crisis might be over, people lose interest in this? Do you have an idea?
Okay, thank you for. So first of all, I think that as statisticians we could play really an important role, because, for instance, building common platform with common criteria, with common protocols would be one of the first point. Because, for instance, the problem is data now are not comparable among states, not comparable within states, among regions, not comparable among hospitals. And this is what makes this story crazy, because the same definition of positive in COVID is different. So in Italy, if you have a low positive, you're positive. In other countries, you're negative. The same also with serological. We use different tests with different cutoffs. And I think that this is really our responsibility as statisticians, because WHO didn't do anything, not even the second phase, to provide some common guidelines in these. So there were documents, but documents will not be read. I think that working on the idea of creating common a platform for CRF, common CRF or something like this would be a way. And the data sharing is the answer. And actually, the reason why hospitals do not share data. I've been doing a research in my hospital that is a big group with 20 hospitals, and about the resilience of scientists in sharing the data, which is a point. And we have found that most of scientists, they feel of the data as their own property, not as the institutional property. The data are person, the data are ourselves. So, and we have to change this way to think of data as a center of power. We really need to change this now, because this is a failure of data sharing. You hear a vaccine and everyone is just keeping his or her own vaccine without saying anything to the others. They talk about efficacy with strange numbers. No one knows what happens. But I haven't heard a G8 of people that just meet and, okay, what do we have? How can we really face this? And I think this is a real failure in, we have been talking about networking, about data integration, about data share. Since 10 years, we have been applying to grants in Europe, getting money for that. But now that was really important, useful, could save life, we failed completely. So I think that the point is there, really to start from a practical point of really building common platforms.
Professor Egger, if you want to add to that, yes.
If I can just very briefly respond. I mean, I totally agree with Matthias that the involvement and the dialogue with the population is extremely important. And I think it was a missed opportunity during the summer in Switzerland that this dialogue wasn't actively sought. But this is not, according to the mandate that we got from the Federal Council, the task of the science, of the science task force. On the contrary, I think politicians actually didn't like the task force to be very present in the media. They wanted us to be an exclusively, science-based, just advising the government. But this wasn't possible because the interest was so huge. And all the members were approached all the time that we ended up in the situation that I described.
From what I find interesting here in this is basically that every communication expert would have told you that this is, and would have told the government that this is going to happen the way it has happened. It's like basic rule number one is if you have a crisis situation, you have to channel your communication and you have to think carefully about what you convey to the public when, and that there is some kind of clarity and uniformity of the message if you want to have some kind of impact. Can
I just say
yes,
to this?
Please go ahead.
I think that one issue was also there was a vacuum. When I think back to the HIV/AIDS epidemic, there was a very strong public campaign, Stop AIDS. Do you remember?
Yes.
And I think the health authorities were much more present in the public and informing the public. And this time with COVID-19, this was quite different. And we also sort of dropped into an empty space, if you like.
I mean, we don't want to turn the discussion now entirely on the Swiss government problem, but it is, I think, what you said is the responsibility for the communication strategy falls squarely to the Swiss government and not to the task force, in my opinion. They should have been in the lead, and since exactly as you said, they didn't do it. It stopped at your doorstep. Now, I want to go back maybe to something that Professor Di Serio said, because about the data. It goes all down to data quality. What kind of data do we have? How do we collect them? How are they uniformly across borders, and so on? And then also comes data protection into place. What kind of data can you share, and so on. Would you say that this crisis these days is really a wake-up call of how also the science as an industry, let's say, has to come up with more standardized ways of collecting data in order to be able to use them more widely? Or is that a very foreign idea that I bring into the discussion here?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, I think that this is just the end of a long story that is lasting since the last 20 years. And this is the reason why only 2 or 3% of the clinical trial reach the end and then really lead to some new treatments. So I think it get along together with this, because the idea of publishing or perishing, it's sort of ruining really and destroying the real idea of science. Science is much slower than that. So up to now, we have only lots of publication with description. It's only statistics. I'm amazed because they only associate this, I see more this, I see more that. And then maybe there is an effect. It's only statistics, but there is no, I don't see a real investigation on why this happens. It's like we try to solve a problem from the end. And so I think that first of all should change really the pressure on researchers from the publishing. And so that also journals has a lot of responsibility. And this pressure is something like a fall with no end. So everyone is pressed, so we have to publish because so we get grants, so we have tenures. If we don't do so, it doesn't matter if it's not perfect, just send it. So, and this is a pressure that is not the rhythm of research. And I think we should try to evaluate also researcher in another way that is not impact factor, not H-index, is not citations, but to really try to change also a way to evaluate researchers. So they will not be have a pressure, so they will analyze data, maybe asking to statisticians, not just with some pre-prepared programs that do not think of anything, and then change really culture. I think this is the chance now to do something like this.
That's a very, very fair point. I like that a lot. And maybe Matthias Egger can also say something later about this, maybe later. on
Leonard, I think Leonard wanted to say
he
something.
also wanted to say something. Maybe then Leo just go and then we go on.
Yeah, I mean, just to catch up on this, I hope and I think that, you know, the open science movement that has been around already before the pandemic, you know, will become stronger and stronger also through the pandemic. And there are wonderful examples. I mean, I mentioned the recovery trial in my talk, which I think is a wonderful example of a clinical trial that, you know, had clear design, clear question, and provided, you know, very good evidence about treatments which work and which don't work. And I just learned recently that you can actually, you know, ask to analyze the data. So this is a trial where you can actually write an email to the principal investigator and ask for the data, and they will give you the data, you know, if you have a clear reason why you need it. And so there are good examples. I also want to briefly mention the vaccine trials, because I think it was implied that we should have data on the vaccine trials. I mean, I'm always open about, you know, having data on clinical trials. There is an issue, as I learned, about these vaccine trials that, as you know, there's a lot of money involved here, right? And so writing a paper with documenting data and analysis code, that takes weeks. And so there's a problem that, you know, insider knowledge inside a company may go in the wrong direction, and authorities are very concerned about this. And this is why they do these press releases only within a few days to limit the risk of these, you know, insider knowledge, buying stocks on Pfizer or whatever. And so there are some other issues here involved, which may make it not possible to completely have open data in these trials. So that's just something I want to mention. Because I mean, it's about, a lot of money and a competition between companies, and so it's complicated.
And if I might add, it's also, there are laws, basically, if these are publicly listed companies, stocks, then you cannot convey data, basically, that could be used for insider trading. That's
Exactly.
That's against the law, so they are very much in a bind there.
Yeah.
You wanted to say something?
I wanted to add, or go on with the discussion also about data sharing. So we, like a lot of you discussed, like data sharing that could be the solution to everything, which I believe is a valid point. However, as I guess the Statistical Office of the Canton of Zurich realized, have been like some errors because they published so fast. And I was wondering, because I mean this was a pretty innovative step of doing this and publishing so fast, and it was pretty risky too. So I guess you have to have a good error culture to be in place in case somebody types in the wrong digit into some spreadsheet. So how do you deal with this at the Statistical Office?
There was a big discussion about this in the last roundtable at the Swiss Statistical Society. But it's about error culture, and it's really important, and you have to work for the error culture. So you can't just make errors. You have to build this error culture and also be perceived like this. And that's what I wanted to illustrate with errors made by the Public Health Department and errors made by us. We publicly disclosed our errors. You could see all errors, how they happened in the GitHub repository. You could see how they were corrected. Our position was a bit easier than the one from the Public Health Department because we just gathered data from other sources. So the errors were made by others. So it was really easy for us to admit. But sometimes there were like errors from us as well. And we just, from the start on, disclosed every error, disclosed every shortcoming we had, and discussed it publicly on Twitter, so everybody could follow. And we also, in the GitHub repository, you can see the history of every data set, and you can see every change that was made to the data set from the beginning. And I think this is really important. Also, the methodology behind it. It's everything open. All the code is open on the GitHub repository. And we can do this because it's not sensitive data. The data Leo told about this is mostly sensitive data, so this is a bit different, but I'm really happy that open science and open access was now a topic too, and that it came up now.
Have you still, I would like to come up with about committing an error and then trying to get it back from the public realm. I mean, I remember or remind you of the age-old story about the spinach and the high level of iron it has in it because of a comma that was set in the wrong space. People still eat spinach because they think it makes them stronger. Sometimes you just can't take back this type of, it becomes some kind of a mythical figure. So are you, even in the light of that, are you still in favor of putting out the current status of a discussion and eventually maybe take it back or bend it a little bit? Or would you say, no, you have to rather wait until you're fairly sure and then put it out? Is fast better than precise? Matthias Matzenauer first and then maybe Professor Heyard.
Timeliness was a big issue in this pandemic because it was really, really moving fast. It's not always about being fast, but in this pandemic, in this chaotic situation, being fast was really, really important. So there is not always it's not always black and white. And the other thing is, yes, especially because of this, I would say you have to publicly disclaim it and go out with it, even if you are not sure. But you have to make that clear, and you have to communicate the uncertainty, even if it's really hard. But we have to trust the people to cope with it, with the uncertainty. All other things lead to fragmentation and polarization and heated debate, and we need to trust the public to deliberatively take decisions. It's really important, I think. And there is no way around it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I can only second that, what has been said. You know, of course, there is a need to communicate, but, you know, as Matthias just said, we need to communicate the uncertainty. And I think that's something that has been missed in this pandemic. I mean, there are, you know, examples of, 420,000 deaths in the UK by Imperial College, and there was not even, a prediction interval. I mean, there was huge uncertainty with this, a number calculated from an epidemic model. And recently there was an article in the British Medical Journal that pointed to this, that there's much more need for scientists to really appreciate the uncertainty in their assessment of what will happen. I think that's and this is where the Swiss Statistical Society and other statistics society really come into place, I think, because statistics is the science of uncertainty, right? And so it's really where we have to play, a major role, if not even the lead role, to change the landscape.
I would like to ask Professor Egger, after his very intense, also not only intense experience with the media, but also extensive experience with politicians, in the light of not knowing exactly where things are developing. I mean, is there an area for education as well, in your point of view, that politicians need to be educated a little better in understanding what scientists tell them?
Definitely. I mean, that was one of the big, I think, shortcomings also of the task force, that we didn't really reach the decision makers. We were present in the Krisenstab, the emergency committee, during the extraordinary situation, but we had very little exchange, really in-depth exchange with the Federal Council, which does take the decisions. So I think the Federal Council and the Science Task Force should have sat together an afternoon or a day and really go through the basics of infectious disease dynamics, the RE, what it means, how you calculate it, why it is so important for policymaking, and what are all the uncertainties attached to it. Absolutely. But that never did happen. And that's what perhaps is my biggest regret, because I'm very upset about the second wave, I have to say. I think it could have been not prevented, but reduced in its scale quite considerably.
So, if that is, thank you very much for all these votes. If that's okay with you, I would slightly move the discussion more towards the more scientific questions about open science, sharing data again, the quality of preprints. Let's focus on that a little more and one more time. And what I've taken from your votes here is that there's a problem with the masses handed in, publish or perish, and that the quality is not very, very good very often. How do you think, from an inside point of view, how could you raise the quality, and also how can you prevent that someone from the media, from the outside, goes ahead and picks and chooses those preprints that kind of fits into their point of view, their worldview, their bias? So how raise the level of what is published as a preprint? I don't know. Is anyone volunteering for answering that? So otherwise, I'd hand it.
Because
I think Leonard.
Preprints, yes. I mean, of course, that's a very difficult question because that affects the whole, scientific ecosystem. And so, what are the incentives, current incentives, and which incentives are wrong and need to be maybe changed? And so I think I mentioned a few of the issues. Maybe I should just answer with a quote from Doug Altman, who's the key leader in bringing rigor into medical statistics, and he once said, "We need less research, better research, and research done for the right reasons." And I think this is the key message. It's not about writing a paper every week. It's about writing a good paper maybe every year.
Well, I could add to also Marie-José Kolly and also Armando Massarenti. That also goes for the media, right? I mean, we could write less, but better, and the world would be better off, I'd say. So would someone, I think Rachel wanted to add.
Yeah, I also wanted to ask one of the journalists in the panel, maybe Marie-José Kolly, because I read your articles with a lot of, I really like them. And I was wondering, so if you go into the literature, you listen to the experts, so how do you, as a journalist, decide on what you trust? So how do you decide that?
Yeah, it's funny that you asked that. I have answered this question on different panels, and so yeah, if I'm gonna put a scientist or a paper in an important, if that's gonna be an important part of an article, I'm gonna do some background research. I'm gonna look up where and how much this person has published, with whom, in which papers, what impact factors they have. So of course I also check these publish or perish affected metrics, but that certainly plays a role. And then I also I feel that when you talk with scientists over and over again from the same field, then you get a good feeling of who has which biases maybe. You kind of get a certain experience in what might be the common ground or the consensus. I'm talking about the COVID-19 context, or many things still seem pretty uncertain, right? And then with other topics, of course, there's more literature in order to build up one's own mind about what is a consensus. But looking for the consensus, of course, is the core task, I would say. And then, of course, it's super important that journalists be fair and don't cherry pick crazy preprints that pretend, I don't know, snake papers, whatever. We've researched into this with my colleague in spring, also this really fast science phenomenon. And we found it pretty interesting too, that in the science community, in the science ecosystem, or at least with the people who we talked to, there seemed to be not a lot of awareness of the fact that what the science community does and publishes on preprint servers gets out. And once things get out into the public, that's what you just said, the error message is not read very often. These vaccines make autism papers are still people still believe in that. And I have it's very hard to have a solution for that. We also didn't come up with more than, well, journalists need to be responsible and scientists need more time from their universities to do proper work and retract papers when they have to be retracted, and that retractions need to be made public, etc., etc. No better idea yet.
Okay.
Serio also wanted to. She raised your hand.
something to what Leonard and also Marie said, that one point is that there is a publication bias, and also in the preprint. So if you have negative results, it's very difficult at getting published. And actually, negative results sometimes are as informative as the positive results. And this is something, so we have been trying to work on this. We have been trying building journals on negative results, but they don't go through. So the problem is that when something is published, it's published only when you find the results. And this is something that must be changed. And second, data quality. Data quality is never checked. So although Nature, Science, they have a checklist and so on, but then you read the paper, and most of the paper do not respect this sort of data quality issues. And sometimes if scientists knew that they could just publish things that are descriptive and they don't need to find p-values and things like that, they could publish also good science without having this pressure of generalizing things that are not generalizable. So there are some findings that could be described and then could give very good hints, but this is not inference. And I think this is really a culture, a data culture that is missed. This is my opinion.
Can I ask a lay question? Is there actually research out there on the question of how to improve this type of, how to improve the communication of scientific data? I'm saying that not very good, but basically what you're telling us here is there is already a problem at the very base of how data is gathered. And then you have the same problems with biases that the journalists, the media have problems with biases. And then we have the politicians that have biases they use. So and that creates, I think, in the end, this public perception of there is no trustworthy sources out there. You find for every study that you find, there is another study that says exactly the opposite. And for lay persons, even journalists like me that are not exactly a trained statistician, we cannot distinguish what is good research and what is not so good research. So are you, as a science community, grappling with this issue of, I can't say exactly what I'm trying to, but are you grappling with the issue that what you pump out there is not digestible for the rest of the world?
I guess that would be a question for Leo, actually.
Leonard, Professor Leonard, and then Matthias Egger, please.
Well, Matthias raised his hand, but I just want to briefly mention, this is of vital importance. And in other countries, I think it has been recognized earlier than in Switzerland. So I mentioned David Spiegelhalter, who is one of the world leading statisticians. He's actually the professor for the public understanding of risk. And he works for more than 10 years now, maybe even 20 years on the communication of statistics to the public. So I think this is exactly what you would like to have and what you want to have. So yeah, people work on this, but perhaps more positions like this should be created also in other countries and not just David Spiegelhalter in Cambridge.
Okay, Professor Egger, and then eventually we will move to the questions from the public.
I understood your question slightly differently, although I agree with what Leo said. I think you were asking for help how to judge whether something is sound research that perhaps should be covered in the media. And I think one sort of toolbox that journalists could also use are the so-called reporting guidelines. These are a set of guidelines which you can download on the web. The organization is called the Equator Network, and there you find guidelines for how people should report They're, for example, longitudinal studies, they're case control studies, they're cross-sectional studies, they're randomized controlled trials, etc. And when you look at that checklist and the paper that you may want to cover, and you go through the paper and the checklist, you may relatively quickly realize that a lot of information is missing, is not reported transparently, etc., etc. And that gives you some indication of whether this is a paper that actually is of high quality or of lower quality. Although these guidelines are really about what people should say about what they did and not necessarily what they should do. But it is very helpful. I use it a lot myself when I review papers, which is sort of similar to what you are getting at. Over.
Thank you. I think we come to the last phase of our discussion here, and we would like to put some of the questions from the audience to before you. So let's see whether we can organize that a little bit. I guess this goes so the first one is a very interesting one, and it goes back to the question of how scientists are incentivized to pump out, or take back this word, but to publish so many different papers and not all of them of highest quality. So the question is by Frank Kalberg, and it is, what changes in the ways scientists are paid are needed to help change the culture to a culture focused more on values such as openness, sharing, inclusion, equality, and creativity? So what changes in the incentives for publishers, for scientists are needed? Maybe again, Professor Di Serio, Leonard, Professor Heyard, also.
Okay, I'm not sure that I understood the whole question. I think that something that changes. For instance, we have most of the papers are published, but the data are not public. And this is an issue that should be considered when people, when a researcher would like really to propose something good. Are you ready also to make all your knowledge public and not just published? And I think this is one point. And then maybe when we hired also young researcher, we should also look very careful, not just on the weight of science, but much more on the quality. So as Leonard said, maybe we should appreciate someone who just published a good paper in 1 year and nothing else, and be suspicious of people that are coming with 30 paper in 1 year. Sometimes you don't even manage to read the 30 paper. I cannot figure out to write them.
Okay, I see that the heads are nodding. Professor Heyard, maybe?
I just want to briefly add to this. I mean, there are exciting initiatives how to change the scientific landscape. We mentioned open science and other things. And I just want to mention, I'm involved in what's called the Swiss Reproducibility Network, which tries to enhance the quality and rigor of science in Switzerland. And it's very encouraging how many scientists from all over the country take part in this initiative. So I think the landscape changes, and it will change quickly, is my hope. But of course, all people who play an important role here, publishers, funders, institutions, universities, they also have to come to grips, and we all have to work together to change the incentives as far as possible.
Mm-hmm. Professor Egger wants to say something on top of that, and then another question.
Yeah, just to add to what Leo said, I think the funding agencies also play a very important role. And the Swiss National Science Foundation has signed the DORA agreement, which is another very important initiative trying to change culture. And we are in the process of changing the way applicants present themselves. We do not want to see long publication lists anymore. We want to focus on contributions to science. So applicants can submit their most important contributions, and this can include peer review, Leo. That's also a contribution to science. And we want to get away from the impact factor. The impact factor is no longer allowed as a criterion. So as Leo said, we all need to work in that direction, and different constituencies has different roles. An important one are the universities. The universities should change how they promote people and how they appoint new professors. There, at least in the medical faculties in Switzerland, the impact factor is still very much the sort of ultimate, or one of the important criteria where people publish, how much they publish, so quantity over quality, etc. And I think that takes time to change, but it's possible.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot for that contribution. There's another question we got from our former president of the Swiss Statistical Society, from Werner Stahl, who's actually a bit more, it's actually a bit provocative question towards, again, I guess, Matthias Egger. So there were 60 experts that have been nominated to form the scientific task force. Is it correct that there is no person that is specialized in statistical methodology? So how were these members actually selected?
So these members are really experts, and then they do not represent, for example, the Swiss Statistical Society. We got a lot of pushback from, for example, the Society for Intensive Care Medicine, the nursing societies, the internal medicine societies. These 68 people, they're all there as individual experts. And I agree with the notion that the statistician should be part of it. There's several, mathematical modelers. They're very numerical epidemiologists on the task force. But yes, there's no statistician in the very narrow sense, but there's a lot of data science in the data and modeling group where I'm also a member. So how this was put together was really based on individual expertise, and also a little bit on the composition of the 10 working groups, so that people know each other a bit and can work together. That was also, obviously a criterion. Over.
I would like to ask this question and address it for Matthias Matzenauer, if possible. There is one from Christian Ruiz, and he asked, what is the role of meta-studies? Is it maybe a solution to get out of the many different parallel studies, or are there shortcomings using meta-studies? Maybe Mr. Matzenauer and also Clelia di Serio, please. So are meta-studies helpful? Could they be helpful in creating more of a streamlined answer to a lot of different research bodies?
I give the word to Clelia di Serio.
Meta-studies are very informative when data are a bit comparable. So this is why at the moment, I would really consider with a lot of attention all the meta-analysis that is done on COVID-19 data, because still we didn't reach some guidelines of common definitions. So there is the risk that you are considering different objects at the same level. But of course, the systematic review of papers and the meta-analysis studies are very important. But still, in this situation, I would be very careful to consider this as an answer to global questions.
Okay, thank you. This one comes as and goes into from I'm not quite sure that the author is not known here, but it's a quote from Marcel Salate from this morning on Twitter. COVID-19 is a historic human event unfolding during a historic time from a communications perspective, in parentheses, social media. And it goes into a direction that I wanted to touch upon as well. It seems that these days, not only do we have open data, preprint, but we also have very, very active scientists on social media, Twitter, and so on. How does that help, or how does that create additional fraction and confusion among non-scientists' audience? I'm not quite sure. Maybe Professor Heyard, but I also would like to hear, I think Mr. Matzenauer is also, I think, active on Twitter. I'm not quite sure, but I think. How does that help, Professor Heyard, to be active on social media?
I mean, I'm not super active with 500,000 followers, but I do my best to advertise our activities with respect to reproducibility. So I think that helps to, if you want to promote ideas, that you are also active on Twitter. But maybe I should actually give the word to Matthias. Maybe he can say more about this.
It's a way to talk to the public and to get response and get feedback to what you publish as well. And it was really important for us. It was a really important way of communication, and not only with the public, but with scientists as well, and with journalists after all as well. And for us, it was just an essential tool to keep in contact with our audience. And I think it's not about what you said earlier, Birgit. It's not about uniformity of the message. It doesn't have to be. If we build an atmosphere where different opinions can live besides each other, and people understand that there are different opinions, it has not to be a uniform message, and we can deliberatively work on an opinion.
I'm tempted to say that this was almost a very good final word. If there are not any other, I think there are not many questions still open, and it seems to me the audience is not trying to say one final word. Then I'm tempted to wrap it up slowly. I'm checking Stella Bollmann. She says 3 more questions left, 3 more minutes left. I'm sorry, 3 more questions? The third. Okay, we have one final question here, which is more of a concrete question about hang on. Okay, I'm not quite sure where I'm going to, who I'm going to give this one. Okay. Go for it, Rachel.
I think it's again by Werner Stahl, exactly. So for each positive test, a form was filled out with some minimal information on the person that was actually tested. So I guess their gender and their age and so on. But has this data actually been used apart from epidemiological? So they have also problems with this word. Epidemiological modeling for statistical analysis and modeling and so on. And where can these results be found? So has anybody in the panel been using this data, or doesn't know about whether this data was used in studies?
So, anyone inclined to take this one? Herr Matzenauer, did you?
I just wanted to indicate that Leo unmuted his microphone, so I thought he might want to answer this question.
Oh. I mean, there are studies on immunitas, right? So corona immunitas is in my house a big study, and so I'm not involved in this. I don't know 100% how specific information from the sheets you fill out when you are tested positive is used here. Maybe Matthias knows more about this from the task force.
I mean, what I can say is that we've got this dashboard where we analyze a lot of data, I think also in collaboration with Matthias Matzenauer. And these data, I think, can be accessed. But I, for example, I'm not involved at all in the Immunitas project. And I don't know whether data sharing is going on there. I assume so, because it's the same department as you are from, Leo. So I'm sure you have this culture in place. I hope so. We are doing, in our institute in Bern, we are doing an analysis with BAG data looking at socioeconomic status. So we're using the BAG surveillance data, we get access to them, to look at socioeconomic position and the risk of being tested positive, being hospitalized, and dying. Because that is an important topic, whether people from less affluent backgrounds and less educated backgrounds, etc., do have a higher risk or not. So that is something I'm personally interested in, and I'm working with open access data from the Federal Office of Public Health.
Mr. Matzenauer?
Yeah, just a quick on another level. We had difficulties, especially and still now, on sharing data in this pandemic between departments in the administration, between universities, and so on. And this is mainly because we don't have like a really good data governance strategy in Switzerland, where it is clear in a pandemic who can use which data under which circumstances. And this really needs to be done. So in the next crisis, whatever it will be, we have these principles in place that help us decide who can use which data on which terms. And we don't have to to discuss every data sharing with everyone.
Thank you. So I think there will be the last question from our the people listening. It's also from a former president, as I was told here, actually a president of the Biostatistics Society or something like that. I'm sorry, from Valentin Rousson. So this is a question about actually how science works in general. So you have people contradicting each other. That's just how science works. And he asks that it is not only about communication, education, or guidelines. There are also scientists who truly disagree on some difficult issues. So what to do if there's two papers out there that have very good quality, but they contradict each other? So how can journalists, for example, deal with this, but also the public? Does anybody want to comment on that? Marie-José, you wanted to try?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you as a journalist try to tackle this, you'd have to talk to a bunch of scientists to find out whether whether the disagreeing paper, whether you have a 50-50 disagreement over the entire community, sort of, or you'd have to find out if this is a sensible thing to think, or if we have, as it is the case right now with COVID-19, or as it is the case with climate science, if you have a broad consensus and a few voices that say otherwise. Right.
If I can add to that, I mean, one of the things in journalism where I think the media makes major mistakes is that they tend to find, they describe the mainstream scientific body, and then they find the one voice that is a dissonance, and they give them equal weight, basically, saying, pretending as if the body of the scientific understanding goes into one direction, and then there are a few outliers there, but they seem to say have equal influence, and I think that is a false. That is kind of misleading, and the media does that very often does that very often because it's easier, and it kind of covers. They're covering basically their hindsight there.
Absolutely. Sorry.
So I think we should wrap it up now. It's a highly interesting discussion, and I would like to thank everybody for participating with a lot of good input. I also want to thank the audience that remained on the line, hopefully till the very end. I hope you all took away some insights about how to get your statistics across when talking to the media. And in any case, be aware that everything you do is very important in order to get this crisis under control. So thanks for my part. And thank you for the organizers for this event, Stella Bollman, Professor Deborah, and my co-moderator, Rachel Heyard. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.